Well, thank you very much, David, and Rob and others for inviting me for this webinar. And I wish I could be doing it in person. I'm very fond of Manchester. In fact, one of my PhD students has just taken a job with you in your economics department. I'm going to begin by saying something about overall progress against poverty before and after COVID-19. And this will be accepted wisdom, if you like. I'm then going to pull that apart a bit, take a rather different perspective on the story and see if it still holds up. In fact, I'm going to argue there are some gaping holes. I'm going to talk a bit about some difficult estimation problems. I'm not going to go into technical detail, but I'm going to talk about those problems in general terms and with enough technical details so you at least know what I'm talking about. Then I'm going to talk a bit about a rather a discrepancy or a gap in the way people talk about our poverty goals globally between the World Bank and the United Nations. And it may not have got much attention, but actually I think it's a huge difference. It's a 3% difference, hence the title of this talk. I'm then going to look at some new evidence on what I call the slowdown, even pre-COVID. Do developing countries tend to see slower rates of poverty reduction as the last few percent, as they reach the last few percent? And I'm going to argue yes. There's now compelling evidence from the success stories against poverty that is the case. In other words, even pre-COVID, I don't think we're anywhere near achieving SDG 1. Even pre-COVID, post-COVID, it's unlikely, very unlikely. But I'm also going to say a bit at the end there about social protection. In a sense, my story here today is about business as usual in terms of our growth strategy is not going to do it. Achieve SDG 1, eliminate global poverty, at least global extreme poverty. And social protection isn't going to do it either, at least business as usual. In neither of these important areas of anti-poverty policy are we going to achieve this goal. And then I'll wind up with some conclusions. Okay, I love this quote from David Nabarro, the WHO Special Envoy on COVID-19. COVID-19 reveals inequality. And that's exactly right. I mean, what we're seeing today, both poverty and inequality, is we're seeing COVID-19 is revealing it. We're seeing things, we're seeing the problems that poor people are facing all across the world in terms of their home environment, in terms of their access to work, in terms of their livelihood strategies. We're seeing everywhere an impact. More in some places than others, of course. With the government policy has been relatively more effective, you see less impact, less of a economic impact as well as less of a health impact. So there's a variance there, but the overall impact is clear, and it's obviously not good news. Let's put it in perspective first. Think of the period post-2000, the new millennium, but pre-COVID. This is a period of great optimism. We saw the developing world on a new growth trajectory. Do we have a problem seeing my slides? Sorry about that.
It worked perfectly earlier, Martin.
yeah, that's what happens. It's just insane. Okay, let's see. Okay, that's clear now?
Yeah.
Looking good.
Thanks. So let's look at that period from post-2000, pre-COVID. A period of great optimism. The new growth trajectory in the developing world, the emergence of almost near-classical convergence globally. We're from 2 worlds or 3 worlds, 2 worlds, let's say, to 1 world. A lot of optimism, obviously a long time before the poor world catches up with the rich world, but we're seeing hope. But we're also seeing rising inequality, roughly half the time across developing countries. I emphasize half the time, not all the time, but some countries doing much better in that respect than others. A tendency for inequality to be rising in the rich world and rising in about half of the developing world, falling half the time. We also saw optimism out of the global financial crisis, at least for the developing world, which came out pretty well. I mean, it could have been much worse. The fiscal surpluses that developing countries had, the better policy environments coming into the crisis, all paid off. Then we got COVID. Let's take a look, think a bit about what that trajectory was looking like before the pandemic. This is a graph of the World Bank $1.90 a day poverty rate over time. I've given it for the world, and I've given it for the world less the high-income countries. That trajectory pre-COVID, back to 1980, was about 1 percentage point per year for the world as a whole. I'm not saying that's good or bad, that's just what it is. Some acceleration in the period since 2000. If you look at the blue dots there, and you see that acceleration, the rate has increased since 2000 with the higher growth rates in the developing world. Passing that forward, a simple linear projection, which in fact I'm going to argue is wrong, but if you just cast that forward on a simple linear projection, it looks promising. We'll actually achieve SDG 1 we'll actually get close to a zero poverty rate by 2030, at least by the $1.90 a day. The progress is reasonably robust to the poverty line. In fact, anything up to the US poverty line, we're still seeing global poverty falling. Obviously, the higher the poverty line, the less the progress against poverty. That's almost arithmetically impossible to avoid. Lower poverty lines, faster progress. You can view that as a good thing, but I emphasize that two things: it is robust to the poverty line, but less progress at higher lines. And we've also got, at least over the longer term, first order dominance, meaning that the claim that poverty rates are falling in the world is, in absolute poverty rates are falling in the world, is robust to the poverty line, all the way up to and beyond the US poverty line, around $15 a day. So all of that pre-COVID story is good. What about post-COVID? No question about the havoc that this is reaping, as I emphasized, to different degrees in different places. It's also wreaked havoc on data. It's obviously hard to collect the sort of data that I've used in all those graphs. I'm using, 2,000 household surveys for millions of sampled households to construct these figures. Data have been a victim of the virus as well, and our confidence about any of this going today, this year, and for a couple of years, I think, is going to be very limited. What we can do is a bunch of modeling projections where we take global economic models, project the growth rates forward. I don't personally do this, so I trust the folk who do it at the World Bank. And we can use those models to project growth rates going forward, but we have to make a distributional assumptions. We have to assume things about how this substantially depleted growth rates due to the pandemic, how they're going to pass through the distribution of income. And that's really the Achilles heel of the thing. If we just pass them through mechanically, assuming everybody grows at the same rate or contracts at the same rate would be more appropriate. We're talking about an extra 60 million people living below $1.90 a day today, this year, due to the pandemic. If you allow a bit for rising inequality, you can easily double that number. Why would inequality be rising? Well, in large part because it's poorer households that are less able to protect their consumption during the pandemic. And we're getting some decent evidence that that's the case, at least in the United States. It's a plausible story. So what does that mean going forward? Basically, I'd say my best guess at this point, about an extra 1.5% of the world's population are living below $1.90 a day this year due to the pandemic. How much is that going to slow our progress? How much have we lost? Well, you can make some simple calculations. If a really optimistic scenario, I'd say, is that the 60 million figure, I think that's hugely optimistic, really. And we assume if we thought that this was going to last for for 2 years, then we'd be talking about, we'd still reach, in expectation, we'd still achieve SDG 1, just barely. Less optimistic scenarios, probably the 90 million figure is a bit more reasonable, and I'm guessing now about 3 years. Then we're starting to 95% confidence intervals around 2028 to 2032 before we'd eliminate poverty according to this goal. You take a somewhat less optimistic story, all consistent with this modeling framework that I talked about, but depending on the assumptions we make about inequality during the crisis, during the pandemic, we could easily be just out of reaching the SDG 1. So bottom line here, there are defensible scenarios which suggest that the pandemic will make the difference, that we won't achieve SDG 1 because of the pandemic, but it's not clear. We might. What I'm going to argue, that's, I guess, my summary of how I see the conventional story, if you like. Many people look at this and say, okay, then maybe just get back to business as usual, we'll be fine. I'm going to argue that's wrong. There's something missing in this whole story, which leads me to question, even pre-COVID, whether we were on track for achieving SDG 1. And I'm going to show you another way of looking at the data, which suggests we're not just off track by a year or two, we could be off track by a couple of centuries. Let me explain. Before I do, I just want to flag one point that often arises that I think is worth emphasizing. I'm getting all these little signs to admit people or not admit people. I assume somebody's doing that. Good. Okay, great. Very idea of somebody not admitted. Inclusive. Anyway, I just want to point out all of this is focusing on the World Bank International Poverty Line. That's obviously a frugal line, as I've emphasized. I also want to point out, even success in SDG 1 is going to leave a lot of people who are still poor by the standards of the country they live in. $1.90 a day is deliberately anchored to poverty lines in poor countries. If you use instead the poverty lines in the countries themselves, actual or in expectation, given the standard of living in the country, then we still see progress. Here I've shown you the trajectory for what I call a weekly relative poverty measure, which is anchored to the predicted poverty lines in the country, in each country. So this is judging poverty by the standards of the country a person lives in, not by this global international standard, which would only be appropriate in low-income countries. Then we're still seeing progress, but we're seeing rising numbers of people living between these two lines, living between an absolute and weekly relative line and an absolute line. Just bear with me. I want to move this little thing out of the way so I can see this properly. And that's just, keep that in mind. I've written a lot about this. We've got the weekly relative concept, I think, has to be internalized properly in our understanding, our monitoring of progress against poverty. But I'm not going to talk about that today. I'm going to focus solely on the World Bank International Poverty Line and SDG 1. So why am I saying something important is missing? Let's step back a bit here. What I've talked about so far is what I'll call the counting approach, where we count people below a poverty line. We construct some poverty measure, poverty gap index, headcount index, squared poverty gap, Watts index. These measures or satisfy or don't satisfy a bunch of axioms that we've laid out in the theoretical literature. And we talk about differences between absolute and relative poverty and so on. There's another approach, and in fact, it's been around for a long time. Philosophically, you find it in John Rawls, The Theory of Justice, 1971. It's an approach, and it goes way back before that, an approach which focuses instead on the poorest, those living at the floor to global living standards. That may not be the biological floor. Hopefully it's above the biological floor, the amount of income you need to survive for more than, say, 2 weeks. It's the lower bound, the actual lower bound to living standards. Now, clearly, to anticipate my argument, clearly, if we could figure out what that floor is, then one implication of eliminating poverty is the floor has to rise to $1.90 a day. So another angle on the whole thing is to assess our progress, is to see whether the floor is rising in the developing world alongside this reduction in the number of poor, absolutely poor, extreme absolute poverty, whether the floor is rising. So that's my question. I'm going to give you an answer. We can motivate this in terms of Rawls's difference principle, talk about that, but I'm not going to go into the details. What is this point about the floor? Well, here are two sets of cumulative distribution functions. And in a nutshell, this is what we're talking about. The pictures on the left show the cumulative distribution of income, two distributions. Let's think of it as 2000 and 2020. And we see a reduction in poverty, a reduction in the percentage of people living below a poverty line. And I've shown that there, okay? Let me get all fancy here. So that's that reduction in poverty. Here's on the right, two other cumulative distribution functions with the same reduction in poverty. So by the counting approach, poverty's fallen in both cases. But on the right, the floor has lifted. On the left, the lower bound to living standards has remained the same. On the right, it's risen. That's the difference I want to bring into the story. I'm not going to say that we should ignore counting approach to measuring poverty. Of course not. It's hugely important. But we need to have this other perspective as well. Many arguments, my favorite, many arguments as to why this matters. My favorite is Mahatma Gandhi's talisman. This apparently was a year or so before he was assassinated. A politician asked Mahatma, how should I judge my success? Politician asking, how should I judge my success? And Mahatma's answer was, recall the face of the poorest and weakest person you have seen and ask if the step you contemplate is going to be any use to them. He didn't say count the number of poor and see whether that's fallen. He said, look at the poorest person, see if they benefited. Okay, well, that was just one little anecdote, but now you start to probe around, you see it all the time. If you look at the Sustainable Development Goals, you will see this expression, no one should be left behind. When you think about rights-based approaches generally, they're not about averages. You don't achieve rights on average. They're universal. None should be left behind. When you look at social policies, similar thing. If you think about all of our main social policies, say the very concept of a safety net, the idea of a minimum wage rate, the idea of universal basic income, concepts of the rights of citizenship, the ILO's social protection for, you start to look at this and you see this concept everywhere. But it's not in our measures. The concept is in social policy. The concept is in moral philosophy. The concept is all over the place. But where is it in the tools that economists use to measure and statisticians use to measure our progress against poverty? It's not there. And it's not just about roles or economics or philosophy. It's also on the ground when we look at the actual policies we see, the rationales that are given. The two biggest social protection, anti-poverty, direct interventions in the world, China's DBAO program and India's National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme. DBAO is a kind of Mandarin slang for guaranteed minimum income. DBAO program is designed exactly to raise the floor. The National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, similarly, using employment and guaranteed wages, guaranteed employment at a stipulated wage rate. Lifting the floor is a common motivation for social policy. So again, if we want to think about evaluating social policy, we can't just use conventional poverty measures. And we also see it, I was very amused because this dawned on me, a few years ago that this was missing, I picked up the Economist magazine, and there was an article on China's poor area development programs, which I've been studying for many years. And to my horror, they didn't look at any of that research I'd done or many other people had done. They didn't look at what the government had done. And instead, they asked how the poorest person they could find in China, whether that person had benefited from China's poor area development programs. And they found this poor guy in Shanxi, and he hadn't benefited much at all. This is another anecdote, but you start to put it all together, and you've got to worry whether we've really got it right. So how could we I've got to put something on the table for measurement. This is actually a very difficult measurement problem. When you do a household survey, you're not typically trying to measure the living standards of the poorest person. I mean, that you never think about it that way. It's even hard to imagine how you do that. We've got to expect that the lowest observed level of income or consumption in any survey is a very noisy, uncertain indicator of the lowest level of living. We're going to have to do some averaging. And in fact, Rawls anticipated this. I don't think Rawls thought at all about the statistics if they knew this. But he talked about the typical level of living of the poorest stratum. He seemed to see that there was a need for some averaging, although I think his reasons are different to mine. So we've got an empirical distribution with a large transient component. Some of those transient factors may be relevant to our assessment of progress, others may not. There's also measurement errors. There's a whole lot of problems. And then when we look at the actual surveys we're doing, we've got a further set of problems. Are we actually picking up the poorest? When you do a household survey, you typically have a household sample frame. But if you don't have a household, you may be outside that sample frame. Good statistics officers try to deal with that, but it's never going to be easy. And there's a whole set of protocols and things that people do all the way from the US to China. But I don't think anybody could be very confident that our sample frames include the poorest. I can't do much about that. All I can do is use the data I obviously have. What I'm going to do, in a natural way, we're going to think about a distribution of, let's call it time mean or permanent consumption or income. We're going to say, this is what I'd like to measure. Right? I'd like my survey to not just be recall of food over the last week. I'd like it to be the last year. I realize it's not practical to ask the last year. Nobody's going to remember what they ate a year ago. There are problems like that in the survey that are intrinsic. The survey period may not correspond with the period of time in which I think I judge somebody's welfare from the point of view of our assessing overall progress against poverty. So I'm going to imagine there's call it the Y star distribution, which I don't observe. What I want to measure is the min of that, the lowest value of the Y star distribution. I'm going to try and estimate the expected value of that lowest level of living in this unobserved distribution. Well, clearly that's going to be difficult. Like any expected value, it's going to be probability weighted. We can think of that as the probability weighted sum of the observed incomes, where the probability here is the probability of any observed income being, in fact, the lowest level of living. Well, that's a natural structure. That's just true by definition. That's what an expected value is. Then everything comes down to, what's this thing? What's a reasonable assumption about that? I'm going to assume the higher your observed income, the lower the probability that you are the poorest person. Seems natural. At some level of income, there's no chance. By implication, the lowest observed level of income or consumption has the highest probability of being the poorest person. Now, immediately, if you know the differences between income and consumption, you're probably thinking, there's a problem, income. Income can be zero, it can even be negative. I grant that problem, and I'm going to try and do as much of this analysis as possible using consumption, which can't be zero. But the problem is there as well. An obvious functional form to make an operational measure of this is to think of the probability function looking like this. When you think about it, it's hard to, I want to go into technical details, but it sort of has to look something like this to satisfy these assumptions. It's in fact a power function. I've got some parameter alpha, which determines how fast that probability falls as observed income rises. And that's going to be a key parameter. In the more theoretical paper that I wrote on this, I talk about different values of that parameter and sensitivity to that choice. Just to keep things simple here, I'm going to choose alpha equals 1. So in other words, the probability declines linearly. The probability of being the poorest person declines linearly. So what does all this mean? Basically, I'm going to take a weighted average of incomes of poor people or consumptions, but I'm going to give highest weight to the poorest, observationally the poorest. So I'm going to add to the mix of our assessments a simple mean, a weighted mean, but a simple mean of consumptions or incomes among the poor, and see whether that's rising over time. Intuitively, if that's not rising to reach eventually $1.90 a day, we're not going to eliminate poverty. What does it look like? This is intuitive. I put this in for people out there who've been studying poverty measurement. One way of thinking about this is that if we ask the question, does growth reduce poverty? If we instead ask the question, does economic growth increase the floor? We're actually asking whether the poverty gap index, for alpha equals 1, whether the poverty gap index with a squared poverty gap index, is falling faster with economic growth than the poverty gap index. That's going to determine whether the floor rises with economic growth. And that's intuitive, I think, because we're weighting those lower incomes higher when we measure the floor to satisfy this assumption that the probability must be fall as consumption or income rises, the probability of being the poorest person. So, okay, I'm going to show you the results in a moment, but I want to come back to this gap that I mentioned, this discrepancy. The World Bank's goal for poverty reduction was 3% by 2030. And as you probably know, I wrote that goal in a paper. Somewhere between Washington, D.C. and New York City, it turned into 0 by 2030. I think some people thought that was not a big deal. Let me tell you, that's a really big deal. I'm going to show you that last 3% is going to take a lot of extra effort. And you can anticipate it's going to involve something to do with how fast or slow that floor is rising. I showed you this already, right? So we got this linear projection that suggests that it's looking pretty good. This is what it looks like when I calculate the floor. Here I've given you the overall mean consumption or income for everybody in the developing world over time, right? So that's this here. And notice, look around 2000. As I said, a new trajectory emerged. Fantastic. I don't think anybody thinks that's bad news. So that's good, right? But look, the floor didn't rise. That new growth in the new millennium has not lifted the poorest. What it's done is meant that there are fewer people living near the floor. But the floor has stubbornly stayed there. And in fact, it's hard to see, but there is a positive slope to that floor. I mean, if you want to know how to deceive with statistics, you could say, there's a significantly positive slope to the floor. It's rising And of course, the T ratio is huge because I've got so many observations, and it's not difficult to get this. But look at it; it's not risen much, but there is a small positive slope. If I project that forward, it will reach $1.90 a day, but in 250 years. Now, so what's going to happen? Is it like in the last day in 2029, the floor is going to suddenly jump to $1.90? It's not impossible, but is that what's going to happen? But we don't see any sign of it. Maybe we should look at some countries and see how they've done. This is just a blow up of this picture. I've also given you the floor for consumption because for obvious reasons, consumption is a better measure of welfare, but it's also going to be a better way of measuring the floor because I guess if you use incomes, negative incomes, I mean, Donald Trump's negative $19 million income one year, which he used to defer his taxes or whatever, he certainly wasn't the poorest person. We know all those stories. It doesn't actually make that much difference, income versus consumption, as you can see. And we see that positive slope over time. A little bit, I'll come back to this because I'm going to try and explain it. So one question, well, what's going on here? I think I've said this. And how do we reconcile these pictures? I've shown you one picture on the left here where we see this progress in reducing the headcount index of poverty, and it's true for other measures of poverty. And we've got this picture on the right where we're seeing that the floor is not rising. So in a funny way, it's like we're reducing numbers of poor, but we're not lifting up the bottom. Now, it's not that we couldn't lift up the bottom. In fact, I've done some really rough calculations because the data is so terrible, but some rough calculations for the rich world when it was part of the poor world, so back to the 1820s, suggesting that the rich world did lift the floor much faster than the developing world is doing right now. In a funny twist of things, it's the developing world has been doing is faster at reducing numbers of poor than the rich world was, but the rich world was better raising the floor. I think it's very suggestive of the effectiveness of social policies, but that is a conjecture on my part. So why are we seeing this difference? Well, I can point to a number of arguments. Geographic poverty traps are really, I think, very much part of this. In other words, that the very poorest get trapped in places, and it could be circumstances as well, where it's harder for them to escape poverty. I like to think of this, just for the economists in the audience, I like to think of this as in terms of the Ramsey growth model. We've got a growth rate of consumption and in equilibrium that's going to be determined by the marginal product of your own capital, how much impact you get from your own income, of course, with the time preference rate, discount rate, and the elasticity of substitution in a standard intertemporal model. And really, my point is that geographic poverty traps arise because local public capital, I say capital quote unquote, but things about where you live influence the productivity of your personal investments. And it seems obvious to us, but it's actually a perspective that's missing from a lot of our discussion of development economics, unfortunately. Other explanations, there are many. Obviously social exclusion issues arise, groups socially, economically who are for identity or discrimination reasons. Dynamic poverty traps also arise, situations where people are trapped in a low level attractor, a stable low level of living, which is hard to escape from, to get onto a sustainable path out of poverty. State capacity is yet another reason. Poorer places tend to have weaker states, and poorer people are less included in them. I'd also point out that transient poverty itself may make it harder to reach the last few percent. We try to deal with it in measurement, as I've discussed, but there's going to be an ebb and flow, where there are going to be people falling in and out of poverty, and even in places with very well-developed social protection systems and very effective states. I'm talking mostly about rich countries, and mostly, I guess, more in Europe and North America. But that's could also mean that it's people fall into have bad luck and the state can't get to them in time. We can't dismiss that. And in terms of the pandemic, I think we're also expecting lasting effects in some dimensions. I think the schooling effects on human capital are going to be lasting. We're also worried a lot in countries like the United States about emerging new large increase in homelessness, particularly when they don't restore this ban on evictions at the end of the month. A lot of issues that could point to lasting effects, making that last 3% harder. And of course, governance and law issues. So there are a bunch of reasons we can talk about and think about as to why this would happen and why business as usual won't do it. A little side step here. I wanted to show you where people live at the floor globally. I guess with the help of a PhD student, I'm quite proud of this map. This map is showing you what countries in the world do the poorest live at the global floor. The global floor, I showed you before, it's about $1 a day at 2011 prices, ICP prices, all right? These are the countries. Now, the interesting thing about this, it's not the classic picture. We've got Brazil. It reflects both levels of living and inequality. Highly unequal societies, highly unequal countries, even with a middle income, upper middle income level of GDP per capita, have people living at the floor. Nowhere in East Asia, PNG, and a number of countries in sub-Saharan Africa. This is the graduation of the floor. This is in terms of using all the surveys that I have available, just showing the blue, darker blue is the higher floors across the world, highest floors in parts of Western Europe and Scandinavia. Using consumption surveys, just take out all the income surveys. That's what the picture looks like. Okay, we've got a few things in place. I want to now talk about the experiences of successful countries. So all of this is leading us to ask, well, okay, what happened? We've got some countries that have been able to effectively eliminate poverty, achieve SDG 1. What happened in those countries? Did the floor suddenly rise in the last day? Or did it creep upwards? Was there a slowdown, or did you just suddenly eliminate poverty? So I'm going to show you some new calculations. The first I did was for Malaysia. I was actually in the University of Malaya as a visiting professor, but I got very interested in Malaysia before and after. But Malaysia, as you may not know, is probably the most successful country against poverty over the last 50 years, measured in terms of the percentage of people living below the poverty line. China is obviously number one in terms of numbers of people, but in terms of the poverty rate, it's probably Malaysia. Possibly, in a top three, let's say. Okay, that's a terrific story, but what happened with that last 3%? Well, this is what it looks like. Here's the official poverty rate using the official poverty line back over time, showing you that amazing reduction in poverty. I have a two-part paper in a recent issue of World Development talking about why that happened, or some aspects of why that happened. I want to focus now just on the last 3%. In 1984, Malaysia got to 3%, $1.90 a day. This top picture, the top graph here is for $4 a day, which is Malaysia's official poverty line, roughly. 1984, it got to 3%. It took 30 years to get to zero, virtually zero. 30 years. In terms of the rate of poverty reduction, the most successful, arguably one of the most successful countries in the world against poverty, took 30 years to get that last 3%. The floor has only been rising in recent times. The floor, this doesn't suddenly rise to $1.90. It's creeps up. It's still not $1.90. The very poorest are still there, and it's not exactly zero. But 30 years to get from 3% to nearly zero. I thought, well, okay, that's suggesting that 3% is a big deal. Let's look at some other countries. We'll start in the rest of East Asia. The last 3% took a lot longer. In fact, here's the East Asia. I've given you both the poverty rate and the floor, the different values of the poverty line, the point above which is no chance of being the poorest by assumption. What does it look like? There you see it. Now, this is just a couple of data points. There's a flattening out in progress in raise lifting the floor, and a flattening out in progress against poverty. Well, that's just one region. It's the most successful region. It's the only region that's got the poverty rate below 3% in the major regional classifications used by the World Bank. That's not very good news. Let's look at the 18 successful countries globally, and I've listed them here. When I say successful country, I mean a country that had a poverty rate of 10% and got it below 3%. And now I'm going to divide it into two periods. The period from 10% to 3% and the period from 3% to whatever it is now. I'm going to ask, did anything interesting happen between those two periods? Did we see a sharp end of poverty, or did we suddenly see a slowdown in progress? A long, painful, long period before the poorest are reached? Well, the answer is definitely the latter. This is what the numbers look like. So in terms of growth rates, those two periods, the period from 10% to 3% versus the period from 3% onwards, growth rates were not very different. Looking at progress against poverty, very different. The first period, the 10% to 3% period, very respectable rates of poverty reduction. The floor rising at a very decent rate, at least by international experience. In the first period, in the second period, vanishes. It's no sign, it just flattens out. Now, these are averages. There are some countries that did better than others. And in terms of the growth rate of the floor, percentage increase in the floor, annualized, very different. So there does seem to be something here about that last 3%, the topic of this whole talk, that last 3%, that's very different, something to do with some of those reasons or all of those reasons that I mentioned before. This is a last point on this before I start to wind up. What's driving this? Well, it's not economic growth, it's inequality. High inequality countries and countries with rising inequality, and that last, as growth proceeds, tend to have it tends to stall progress in lifting the bottom. In the US, it's really striking. I have another paper with co-authors on what's happening in the US with the floor. And in the United States, the floor has actually been on a downward slope for many decades. And remarkably, as the super rich get super richer, the floor sinks. There's something deeply embedded in inequality and inequality during the growth process that's tied up with the living standards of the very poorest. That's still a set of researchable issues. I'm going to just say a few things about social protection. I've got to say something about this because the obvious question is, well, has social protection helped? I mean, there's been a huge expansion last 15 years in social protection programs in the developing world, as you probably know. And today, almost every developing country has at least one program. In many countries, it's not covering many people, very few, but we've seen a huge expansion. We've got roughly 1 billion people receiving some form of assistance. How much has the floor helped those people? Well, I can do the calculation. This is a paper with Juan Margitic and JDE last year. Basically, we're figuring that the social assistance, as it has operated in practice, has only lifted the floor by about 1.5 cents per day on average in the developing world. 1.5 cents. To put that in perspective, that's about 10% of mean social spending, social assistance spending. In other words, if you just taken that social assistance spending, which is targeted to poor people, and given it to everybody as a universal basic income, you would have lifted the floor more. The left behind is a really serious concern, including clearly about social policy. As you spend more, you tend to have more impact on the floor. So that's good news, I guess. Spending more helps. The efficiency in reaching the poorest is not much correlated with spending. So here I've given you the top here is the standard measure we get in the social protection literature, what I call gap transfer efficiency. That's just the share of the social spending reaching the poorest, 20% in this case, the widely quoted numbers. On the bottom here, I've given you this new thing, the floor transfer efficiency. This is the gain in the floor per dollar of social spending. For each dollar of social spending, how much lifts the floor? Not much change, not much correlation with levels of social spending. And in fact, if we do a simple decomposition of the proportionate differences between the post-transfer floor and the pre-transfer floor, there's a measure of how much social policy is lifting the floor, then the vast bulk of that variance, over 3/4, is due to levels of spending. It's not due to efficiency in reaching the poorest. Richer countries tend to have a higher floor, so there's some sign that economic development does help lifting the floor. That average dollar averages across higher and lower numbers and higher levels of the floor post-transfer in richer countries. No great surprise there. Also, nearly final point, these are just regressions for the pre-transfer floor, regressed on, you can ignore column 1, I won't talk about it, but column 2 is the pre-transfer floor regressed on mean income. And the interesting thing about that is that the elasticity is less than 1. In other words, the floor tends to fall as a percentage of mean income as mean income rises. That's pre-transfer. Post-transfer, it's very close to 1, not significantly different from 1. So good news there, that the social policy seems to be preventing the floor rising as a share of mean income. If it wasn't for social spending, the floor would be falling as a share of mean income. With social spending, it's almost keeping up, almost. So yes, left behind, but yes, if not for social spending. So some aspects look more encouraging than others when we look at everything here. To summarize all this, social protection in the floor, we've seen it on average is lifting the floor, but by a rather pathetic 1.5 cents a day. Social assistance. There is some heavier lifting being done by social insurance, pension schemes. So free transfer floor, we see falling relative to mean income, but with social policy, it's kind of roughly keeping up. And the bulk of the effect of economic development in lifting the floor, which I haven't mentioned this, but the bulk of the effect of economic development in lifting the floor is direct rather than via social spending. It's not that richer countries spend more, which lifts the floor. It's primarily just economic development, more jobs, higher wages, etc. Conclusions. Okay, I think I hope I've at least cast some doubt on the idea that going back to business as usual in terms of the growth and development strategy is going to do the job. And the seeds of this problem were there pre-COVID. They were looking at us in the face. The last few percent will be much harder to reach. And I think unless there's some super magic going to happen in that last day, the floor is not going to catch up. We're going to have people left behind. The last few percent are going to be much harder to reach. They will not be reached by business as usual, either with the development strategy or with social policy. I leave aside the question of trade-offs here. I'm deliberately not going down that road. you can have a discussion. We can have a discussion. I don't think we know, but we can have a discussion about whether there are serious trade-offs in reaching the poorest. Maybe it's going to cost a lot more, and that could be something people are concerned about. I guess my instincts are always to try and focus on the poorest first and lift them. Once you've lifted them to $1.90 a day, keep going, of course, lift them further. And I would argue that's probably the most important single dimension of our progress, social progress. But I know people don't agree with me. In this respect, I guess I'm Rawlsian, but I know I'm not alone, but I also know many people don't agree. Thank you very much.